Hi there, this is Scott Moyers. I'm a friend of the Sun Valley Writers Conference, and I'm delighted to participate in this installment of the series of literary conversations, SVWC Now, a talk with Roger McNamee, the noted, dare I say legendary, tech investor turned passionate anti-Facebook activist. Now, this is where I confess that in my day job, I work at Penguin Press, an imprint of Penguin Random House, and am Roger's editor and publisher. So, to avoid any appearance of bias, instead of telling you myself how swell the book is, I will hide behind the New York Times book review, which called Zucked, quote, a candid and highly entertaining explanation of how and why a man who spent decades picking tech winners and cheering his industry on has been carried to the shore of social activism. That strikes me as a pretty good note on which to begin this conversation. Roger, it's so good to see you.
Great to be here, Scott.
So, tell us, you were the notorious RMC. You are a very noted tech investor. I think of there's a very famous quote of Upton Sinclair's, it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. I think one of the things I really admire about you is you had every reason not to turn against Facebook, and yet you did. I wonder if you could explain how you got to that point when you were having the role you had with Facebook, and then that moment of turning.
So, Scott, it's absolutely true. For 30 years or more, I was a relentless technology optimist. I was lucky enough to arrive in Silicon Valley as the personal computer industry was beginning. And I grew up with Steve Jobs and Bill Gates before they were billionaires and got to enjoy the era when Silicon Valley was in the business of enabling its customers. The technology, in Steve Jobs' parlance, was a bicycle for the mind. It was not just good for you, it was fun. And so that era really formed my whole view of the world. And when I knew Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg best, which was from 2006 to 2009, I had a great relationship with them. I liked them very much. And Facebook in those days was doing something that I thought was really valuable for society. It was requiring authenticated identity from every single user. And it was giving them control of their privacy. And I thought, wow, if they're going to do these two things, they're not just going to be the first social network that mattered. They were going to do it the right way. I stopped being active there in 2009, which was several years before they evolved the business model for which they're famous today. And candidly, I just wasn't paying attention. Things were going on in Silicon Valley. The culture was changing. And that idealism, the empowerment mantra that was so central to my enthusiasm, was being eaten away as the power of computers and the power of global networks allowed companies to create predatory business models. And I'm thinking here of companies like Spotify, which took advantage of the ignorance of musicians, or Uber, which took advantage of the ignorance of drivers, or Airbnb, which took advantage of basically rule breaking in the hotel business. And I just got really sick of it. So I decided to quit. And what happened was, when I retired from investing, about a month later, I'm on Facebook because I love Facebook. And all of a sudden, I start seeing things that really disturb me. Initially in the Democratic primary for the 2016 election. It's January, and I'm seeing hate speech from fans of Bernie Sanders targeting Hillary Clinton, spreading on Facebook virally, which suggested people were spending money to spread that stuff. And all of a sudden, my instincts as an analyst kicked in. And I didn't know what it meant. But soon I saw a thing related to Black Lives Matter that was a violation of the civil rights laws. And then in June of 2016, the UK voted on Brexit. And that was the first time when I realized that the same tools that make advertisers so successful on Facebook could be used to interfere in an election. And I totally freaked out. I started looking for allies. I went around to people who were like tech journalists and said, hey, are you seeing any of this? And none of them were. In fact, they really didn't care until the news came out about Paul Manafort and the Russians. And then Walt Mossberg, the famous Walt Mossberg, partner of Kara Swisher, founder of Recode, invites me to do an op-ed. And I'd never written an op-ed before. I had no idea what I was doing. And it took me more than a month to get it done. And on October 30th of 2016, so 9 days before the election, my wife suggested I send the draft op-ed to my friends, my former mentees, Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg, and see if I can't persuade them to make changes. Because what I was seeing was a platform where the culture, the algorithms, and the business model would let bad actors, like the Russians maybe, do great harm to innocent people. And I couldn't believe that Mark and Sheryl would be comfortable with that. And it occurred to me that they were probably the victims. So I sent this thing to them, and they both responded immediately. But it was kind of like, Roger, we totally take care of all this stuff. It was sort of classic Facebook, an apology and a promise to do better. But they handed me off to one of their colleagues. And for several days in a row after that, I'm begging him to do the right thing. Then the election happens, and at that point, I start screaming. And this goes on for 3 months. And I'm basically going, you guys have undermined Brexit. You've undermined the US presidential election. And you may not have done it on purpose, but it was a consequence of your business model. Well, they just blew me off. And that, Scott, is when I was faced with this moral dilemma. I'm retired. Maybe I just say this is somebody else's problem. But for whatever reason, my value system couldn't allow me to sit back quietly. And so I decided to become an activist, which was not a role that I ever anticipated having.
And was that uncomfortable for you in terms of the community you were living in?
I had a huge advantage. So the answer is, of course it was. I mean, most of the people that I'd spent my professional life with viewed me as having done something that violated the values of Silicon Valley. So, in a sense, I was a traitor, right? Many of them just thought I was nuts. But whatever it was something that I shouldn't be doing, that I should just quietly accept that I'd been a participant, I'd made money from this, and I should just let them go about their business and be retired. But here's the thing. I began my career as an investor in the public market and in mutual funds at T. Rowe Price. And the truth is, if you have to have the support of everybody around you, if you're not comfortable being different, you're never going to be a great public market investor. So I was already comfortable with the notion that everybody was going to disagree with me. Was it disappointing? Oh, God, yes. I basically threw away 34 years of relationships, and not all of them. But the really cool thing is, Scott, I've got a lot of new friends that I didn't have before. And the experience on balance has been massively frustrating because, I set out to warn the world about what had happened in 2016 to make sure we didn't repeat it in 2020. And sadly, the exact same stuff is happening again. Different players, slightly more evolved techniques, but, disinformation completely dominated the Democratic primary, and it completely dominates COVID. We can't have a rational public health response because it's become part of the culture war. And that is infuriating.
It's occurred to me that to some extent you were conditioned because you were of Silicon Valley, but you also have another life. You're a musician, and you're actually a pretty serious musician, and your relationships as a musician have led you into some interesting realms. And in fact, wasn't your connection to Facebook and your fingertip feel about Facebook related to your band, Moon Alice?
It is absolutely true that both my ability to understand Facebook was greatly enhanced from running a band in a Facebook group. And so I really learned all the tricks for how they scaled things while it was going on. And then it was because I was in a band, it was because the fans of the band were spreading the hate speech that this Facebook group that was associated with Bernie Sanders was putting out. That's how I saw it. And so you're absolutely right. In some ways, I was tailor-made to take up this activism because of the nature of my own life experience. And in some ways, I'm just horrible at it because you know, as an activist, a guy who was an insider, an investor, no less, and a very successful one, is not necessarily going to be the most sympathetic creature that you're going to meet in that context. Better to have somebody who's a victim. So as an advocate, I have had severe limitations. Fortunately, there are all these other people in the field who are far more sympathetic and far more articulate than I am. And that has allowed me to pick my spots and add value here and there without having the thing be dependent on.
Now, Roger, one of the most impressive to me things about the achievement of the book is that you were sort of building the plane while you were flying it. You were living this new role and learning and gathering allies and perpetrating your activism, even as you were narrativizing it. And I observed you do this in real time. It was very impressive. And then, of course, you're in your paperback. Most people just slap a new preface onto their paperback. Your paperback is like a gut reno. It's like 35% new material, which just speaks to how fast moving the story is and how. So can you just give us a sense for what that's been like to be in the middle of this particular storm and what you think the good has been and what have been the happy surprises and what have been the sort of unpleasant surprises?
The thing about writing the book was when you and I first got together, we had an arc in our mind for what the story was that was really about the 2016 election. It was about, for the most part, it was about democracy and about brain hacking, this notion that they can use individual targeting and the massive data they've collected, which is essentially a data voodoo doll in each one of us, to manipulate what our attention sees and therefore what our choices are. That's what the initial focus was. And we were aware, maybe I'd given you 4 chapters when Cambridge Analytica broke. And Cambridge Analytica, I believe, starts at chapter 7 of the book. So I caught up to it while it was going on. And the only 2 chapters that you rejected were the first 2 chapters on Cambridge Analytica, because I had steam coming out of my ears. I was so angry. And you went, Roger, this tone is not going to work. And made me rewrite them both, which I'm really glad I did. But as you know, the story didn't stop when we submitted the final draft that went in to be typeset for the hardcover. In fact, all hell was breaking loose while that was going on. And we wound up writing a chapter after the midterms that we stuck onto the end of it. And it consciously, because the story was just still playing out. And then when I started my book tour, a whole new set of things happened. And it became incredibly obvious that this book is something I could update every 3 or 4 months. In fact, if we wanted to, we could add a bunch to it now. What's so clear, what I tried to do is to use a memoir format to make this accessible to everybody. There have been insider books. There have been, sort of TikToks, blow by blow of how some of the startups worked. There have been books written by academics. And this is essentially, because I use the memoir form and because I was there in the early days and because I've been around Silicon Valley forever, we were able to do something that used the narrative of my discovery as the narrative of the book. And so the book teases out the thing, not from a perspective of knowing all the answers and trying to explain them to you, but the early chapters were written in complete ignorance of what I knew 5 chapters later. And we didn't go back and change that.
Your learning curve became our learning curve. I think one of the things that's people find most illuminating about the book, because of your deep perspective on the evolution of Silicon Valley, is that in a previous era of Silicon Valley, you wouldn't have a bunch of 20-somethings without adult supervision. That you had a new reality that was fundamentally different from the old reality in terms of adult supervision. I wonder if you could just speak to that a bit, because I think it's really important.
Yeah. So here's the thing. From 1956, which is when the AT&T consent decree with the Justice Department over an antitrust case took the transistor and put it into the public domain, effectively created Silicon Valley, till about 2003 or 2004. If you were an engineer in Silicon Valley, you were always working with way less processing power, storage, memory, and bandwidth than you needed to do what you wanted to do. And the problem with that was that people had big ideas, but the benefit was huge because it forced the engineers to spend all their time understanding the customer's needs and doing those precisely. Now, beginning around 2003, first memory, then processing power, storage, and then finally bandwidth caught up. In fact, blew away the needs you would have for any individual application. So for the first time, you could create a service like Facebook, like YouTube, that was global and that could be used by everybody. And in fact, you could do it without ever listening to anybody. There was a thing that came along with that people did not initially appreciate, which was that once you had a surplus of everything, you could create a service like Amazon Web Services, which would host all the technology needed to launch a product like Facebook or like Netflix or like YouTube. The reason that was so important was that in the days you had to build it all yourself, the cost would be $125, $130 million just to release a product before you did any marketing, before you did anything. With Amazon Web Services, you could get all that infrastructure with a credit card, which meant the cost of doing a startup fell from maybe $125 million to $10 million. Well, at $10 million, the risk is so much lower that instead of hiring an entrepreneur who's 45, who's been through all of this before and is a responsible adult with children in school, and you can trust him to not, party his way to oblivion, suddenly it became attractive to have 20-year-olds. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg could never have been hired 5 years earlier to run a company. It just wouldn't have happened. But he arrived at the perfect moment. And the thing is, that moment came right after the internet bubble burst in 2000. And the venture industry ran for the hills. In that void stepped what are now known as angel investors, individuals coming out of the industry. Because the amount of money to do a startup was so much lower, they could play the game. The venture guys stopped being a governor. They stopped being a quality control system. And that's when a small group of people who'd been the founders of PayPal, so here we're talking about Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, Reid Hoffman, and the rest of that group, they were the first people to have the insight that the technology was no longer going to be a barrier. And in fact, they also realized that the internet could pivot from being a network of pages to being a network of people, which is really the philosophy that underlays social media. And those two insights together were the most valuable ones, I would argue, in the history of Silicon Valley. And that group of people, had they had a traditional Silicon Valley value system, might have taken us to a very different place. But these guys had a hyper-libertarian value system. They had this whole notion that as an entrepreneur, you weren't responsible for the consequences of what you did, that you could have disruption. And if it hurt somebody, well, that was their problem. Well, that was not a widespread belief before them. And because of their success first with LinkedIn and then with Facebook, that everyone embraced that philosophy, which is how you wind up with Uber and WeWork and all these completely insane ideas and really sociopathic business models. And, it didn't have to play out that way. I mean, that was a serendipitous thing that those guys happened to be the ones who had the insight. And their success transformed the culture of Silicon Valley in a way that has really undermined public health, particularly during the pandemic, democracy since 2016, privacy everywhere. And frankly, I think it's completely distorted Silicon Valley, which is no longer the engine of innovation and growth it used to be. It's now a monopolized system that we're having to fight instead of benefit from.
So let's dilate on that word sociopathic, if we can. So I think a lot of people are sympathetic to not seeing this coming, but fewer and fewer people are sympathetic the more the evidence mounts. And I remember you telling me way early on that the big game is the hearts and minds of the employees within Silicon Valley who don't want to work for evil companies. We've seen some of that dis-ease within Facebook just recently. How do you think that's going, and where is it going? The hearts and minds battle within this community.
So when I began my activism, my goal was to persuade the founders, right? So Mark Zuckerberg or the founders of Google to change, because they're the ones with total control. So if you can move their hearts and minds, you're done, right? So after them, the employees have the next most leverage. You can't run these companies without the employees. But I think it's fair to say that until the last 12 months, the employees were every bit as much a part of the problem as the founders. Think about Facebook. I'm not aware of any employees who publicly voiced any concern about the role the company played in the interference in Brexit, the role it played in the interference in the 2016 election. I'm not aware of anyone expressing any concerns about enabling the genocide in Myanmar. I'm not aware of anybody being concerned about the role Facebook played in the terrorism in Christchurch, New Zealand. Basically, the only thing Facebook employees had ever pushed back on was the use of arbitration in sexual harassment cases for employees inside the company. Until now. And what happened here is, I think the last 2 months have crystallized in the minds of a set of people who previously were ignorant of it, the role that Facebook, but also YouTube and Twitter and Instagram play in essentially amplifying the most harmful messages in society. And it came to a head because Twitter, a business which for all intents and purposes was made by the Trump presidency. You know, Trump's use of Twitter made Twitter the centerpiece of journalism. It really replaced the Associated Press as the heartbeat of journalism. And so in that context, Twitter basically just let Trump do whatever he wanted. And then suddenly a few weeks ago, they, for the very first time, fact-checked a couple of Trump tweets. Now keep in mind, Trump has had literally, I believe, thousands of tweets that were filled with lies. But they finally fact-checked 2 of them. And then the next day, they did something even more astonishing. They put a public safety warning when he was talking about looters and shooters and effectively inciting violence. That was a really crystallizing moment because Facebook employees had the exact same messages had been circulated on Facebook. And Mark Zuckerberg had come out and said, we're not going to fact check or edit or censor the President of the United States. And on the public safety one, I think a lot of people just went, well, hang on a minute. Inciting violence is not why we're here. And so a few hundred people staged a virtual walkout. Now, what we don't know is how many people actually strongly hold a view and what they're willing to do about it. Because the sad truth is Silicon Valley, because right now it's dominated by a handful of monopolists, you know, is a place where if you get a reputation as a rabble-rouser, you're not going to be welcome at most of the other big companies. And so I'm concerned that this will be like the Google employee walkout of a year ago. One of those things where there's a moment of heat, but no light, that they will quash this very effectively. You know, they have surveillance on their employees that you just wouldn't believe. And they have a lot of tools in their tool chest for suppressing dissent, just as Google went and systematically got rid of all of the people who organized the walkout there. And so I think it remains to be seen. And the question is, do the employees respond to that by becoming more proactive on these issues, or do they retreat defensively and simply put up with it? The one thing I know is that Facebook's ability to recruit has been badly harmed over the last 12 months. College kids who used to view Facebook as one of the top 2 or 3 places in the country to go work now view it way, way, way down the list. In fact, many people hold a very negative view of it. And in the long run, that's going to be an issue for them. But I think the problem they face today is, for the first time, I think this has percolated out into the population as a whole. I think that we saw in Georgia more than 1 million people turned up for a primary where the active voter suppression was so extreme, it was designed to have a third that many people vote. And people stood in line for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 hours to vote. People are really, really concerned about the state of the country right now. And I believe that if you went and polled those people and stood in line, whether they think Facebook has anything to do with the problems we're dealing with right now, that a majority of them would tell you yes. And that suggests, as Biden's statement that Facebook needs to be reformed suggests, that if there is a change in administration, Facebook's undisguised bet on Trump may prove to be a big political issue. Now, they have a huge Washington operation. They spread money around like the best lobbyists you can imagine. And so, I don't think, they still have all the tools, but they've really harmed their brand here. And here's what's really sad and weird about it. Facebook has been a great tool during the pandemic for staying in touch. But it has, at the same time, also been the go-to tool for organizing the quarantine liberation movement, for organizing the anti-vax movement, and for absolutely stigmatizing public health solutions like masks, all of which are, horrible for public health and are views that are not only not held by a majority of the country, they're held by a very small minority who, because of the way Facebook works, because of the way Twitter and YouTube work, their voice appears to be much greater than their numbers.